What's up, YouTube? I'm the Upstate Prepper. Before we go and get into this, if you've been here before, welcome back. If you're brand new, do me a favor, hit the like button, the subscribe button. The algorithms are terrible. Help a small channel get a little bit bigger. Maybe I can reach a few more people to talk to. I'm just a guy that's trying to navigate village prepping and realizes there's a need for it. Would be wise to prepare for uncertain times that are coming. I like to talk about prepping, I like to talk about politics, and I like to talk about history. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about all three. Something that's been bothering me lately is the political landscape in the United States. We get focused on these words like Republican and Democrat. And it occurred to me, these are very vague, loosely put together words in these times. We throw in words like liberal and progressive and conservative, and I don't think that most people even really know what any of these things mean. They're completely clueless as to the meaning of these words. If they knew the meanings of these words, I think most people would find that they're not what they think they are. For example, we label to the right Republican, to the left Democrat. Well, let's go back to the beginning. Back in the 1780s, when the Founding Fathers formed into the Continental Congress after the defeat of the British in the Revolutionary War, we developed this document called the Articles of Confederation, which loosely put a group of independent states held together by a very small federal government that was in charge of protecting the borders, maintaining the military, and not a whole lot more. After a short period of time, there developed a consensus of some that this was not a viable document to go into the future with. So what happened was some of the Continentals, people like Adams, went into the Continental Congress and wanted to develop a different document. And the document that they developed, actually by themselves, was the United States Constitution. And when they got to the Continental Congress, there was a major uproar over the Constitution being developed. People like Thomas Jefferson, people like Patrick Henry were vehemently opposed to the Constitution, was completely the opposite of what the Continentals were fighting for. They did not want a Constitution. They did not want to take any chances of tyranny. And there was much debate, much argument, much everything over what was the United States Constitution. And they refused to sign it. So these several states just flat out were refusing to sign it. And through the course of a couple of years of negotiating, there developed two sides, a Federalist side and an anti-Federalist side. Federalists were pro-Constitution. Anti-Federalists were pro-state power, individual freedom, and state control over people. So you had two totally diametrical different philosophies taking place. What ended up happening is in order to get these representatives to sign the Constitution, it was agreed upon that we would develop what we now call the Bill of Rights, with the first 10 amendments being placed into effect. Excuse me. This Bill of Rights is what eventually convinced the anti-federalist members of Congress to sign the Constitution. In fact, they refused to sign it without it. So the Federalists, they weren't necessarily looking to establish the Bill of Rights. The Constitution was a document that outlined the federal government, the power structure of the government. This is what the federal government is in charge of. This is what the state's government are in charge of. And there was a few things that they were both in charge of together. For instance, maintaining the military was the power of the federal government. And there was several different things that were more or less the larger things that needed to be handled. Commerce issues and trade, that was handled by the federal government. And then everything else basically was subjugated to the states to control. Along with that, the Constitution itself talked a lot about liberty, but it really didn't talk about individual liberties. So that was the compromise. The Anti-Federalists would get the Bill of Rights, which guaranteed the rights of the individual, and the federal government would get the Federalists would get the Constitution, which set up the government into a larger, more federalized government than the Articles of Confederation dictated. This became an issue of much arguing. I would venture to say that arguing still takes place today. Eventually, these names morphed into new names. First, it was the Whigs and the Tories. The Whigs were the Federalists. The Tories were the Anti-Federalists. Then, as those names kind of shifted, because those were names out of the British Parliament, it shifted to Federalist still, and it shifted, instead of Tories, to Democratic Republicans. Thomas Jefferson was the creator of that party. He was an anti-federalist. So things progressed over time. We get to the 1850s. The Democratic Republican Party threw out the Republican moniker and just became the Democratic Party. The Federalists split into two. And the Republican Party was formed out of the Federalist Party. Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president. And what a Republican was in that time was essentially a Federalist, but also an abolitionist. Those were the basis of the Republican Party. Federalism, keeping the republic together, abolition. So after the Civil War is concluded, which I should point in, obviously the Republic, the North, the Union won the day. The Confederates, which had seceded out of the Republic, were brought back into the fold. Now from there, things got a little bit crazy. Now, I went to high school in the 1980s, and I'd like to think that I received a decent education back at that time. I definitely know it was a different education. I know lots more about American history than anybody that's 35 years old or younger. At least any normal person. In fact, I've come to believe that which we call American history has largely been altered and changed. And it's not what you think is not what was. History's a lie. The Democratic Party, well, that was the party of the KKK. That was the party of the South. That was the party of the slave owners. That was the party of the Knights of the Golden Circle. That was the party of hate. The Republican Party was the abolitionist party. Should point out that the Gettysburg Address and that which followed the Emancipation Proclamation did not free all the slaves. It only freed the slaves in the South if they could get away. The slaves were not actually freed until the 14th, 15th, and 16th Amendments after the Civil War, a year afterwards. That is what freed all slaves in the entire United States. So we move forward. That's what the Democrat Party is. That's what the Republican Party is. We get to the 1920s. And in the United States, the KKK was flourishing in the Democratic Party. There were people being elected into government all over the place. In fact, it's largely considered that American President Woodrow Wilson was in the KKK, was a member. In fact, the very first motion picture, what was that called? History of the... Well, they had to change the name of it, but it was about the KKK. That was the first movie that was ever screened in the White House. One of the very first movies that was ever created. We get to the 60s. All this time, it's segregation, discrimination. And the party that favors that is the Democratic Party. We get to the 60s, and everything changes. All of a sudden, the champion of Black America becomes the Democratic Party, and the villain becomes the Republican Party. Now, the last over 100 years of American history were no longer relevant. It no longer mattered that the Republicans were the abolitionists and the Democrats were the slavers. All became as though it didn't even happen. So something happened. The reason that we're going through this little brief through time is simply because something happened. And it occurred to me, it's been occurring to me for a while, but it's really occurred to me that American citizens are really not very smart. We don't know anything about civics. We don't know about government. We don't know what things mean. We don't know what they stand for. And I think that the federal government really doesn't want us to know. Because somehow that changed. And all of a sudden the Republican Party was vilified as though we were somehow, they were somehow anti-black, which was never historically the case. Time moves on. We talk about progressives, we talk about liberals and conservatives, and then libertarians, and trying to navigate what all these things mean. And it occurs to me, they mean very little. The words that we should be focusing on are socialism, fascism, National Socialism, and capitalism. These are the important words. You can take Republican and Democrat and throw them in the garbage. They're meaningless. What's important is capitalism, socialism, fascism, and National Socialism. I noticed, you see on TV, and then former president number 45 is constantly being referred to as a fascist. And I think to myself, in fact, I watched one video, one creator that was talking about it, and would show a picture of 45 and say he's a fascist. And then it would show another picture of someone wearing a red hat with carrying an American flag, and here's his army. And I thought to myself, well, this is crazy, because I don't think I'm a fascist. In fact, I'm pretty sure I'm not a fascist. So I thought about, well, I'm going to have to find out exactly what we're talking about here, because there's so many problems. I mean, Mr. 45 is about as pro-Israel as pro-Israel gets. If fascism and Nazism are the same thing, National Socialism, if those people are fascists, well, he can't be one. His daughter's married to a Jewish American. He's instrumental in getting the Abrahamic Accords signed. How can that possibly be when he's so pro-Israel? And the answer is, he can't. And one of the reasons is because fascism and National Socialism are not the same thing. They are similar, but they're not the same. And you don't get told that. You just get blasted with fascism and National Socialism as being this all-encompassing evil. And they both are. But they were very different. Well, why were they different? Well, because they say they were. Benito Mussolini, before taking over the fascist party in Italy, was a devout socialist. He was a Marxist that became disillusioned with the Marxist party in Italy and joined what had recently been created, the Fascist Party. Mr. Funny Mustache Man over in Germany, in his speeches and in his book that he wrote in the 1920s, Mein Kampf, proclaimed himself a socialist, and that was what he was. He too was a Marxist that became disillusioned with Marxism and became a National Socialist. But he still called himself a socialist at all times. He never once disclaimed being a socialist. In fact, the party's name says National Socialist. And for some reason, we're not smart enough to say, gee willikers, it says socialist right in the name. I'm willing to bet they're socialists. And they were. Just a different kind. Socialism's kind of like ice cream. You can get a strawberry cone. You can get a chocolate cone. You can get a vanilla cone. You can even get a twist, a combination of two flavors. ice cream and socialism have a whole lot in common. Because no matter what flavor of ice cream you get, you still have ice cream. Socialism is exactly that way. There's different flavors. There's Marxism, which is communism, which initially was translated into Leninism. And those, when Lenin died, or he probably was killed by Stalin, when he hit his demise, there were different ideas about socialism and how to use socialism to get to communism, because they're two different things. Communism is a political and economic philosophy. Socialism is a political philosophy. So socialism was the tool to get to communism. Well, Lenin dies. We have two leading contenders to take his place. Lenin's right-hand man and his left-hand man. We have Joseph Stalin and we have Leon Trotsky. Well, Stalin wins, as we all know. Trotsky gets sent away. In fact, was eventually murdered by Stalin. But they had different ideas, because socialism is all about class. Class. You see, Lenin, he thought, well, we've got workers, we have peasants, and we have elites. And under Lenin's socialism, he believed, well, this is for the workers, this is the Workers' Party, but they're not that smart. They really don't know what they're doing. They can't handle government. They can't handle really anything other than working. So what we need to do is us elites, us intellectual, educated, college-educated elites, we're the guys that need to be in charge. And we can let them have their Duma, and they can send their representatives into the parliament, but the real power is going to be in the Kremlin, and we're going to run the Kremlin. It was, in fact, a totally different party that operated in the Kremlin than what operated for the nation. So the idea of Marxism was to be a globalized infusion of socialism all across the world, and eventually achieve worldly communism, the perfect utopia for everyone. Well, first and foremost, that's never happened. Never once has there been true communism on the planet. It's never existed. Marxism has proven itself to be unattainable. So we had Leninism. Then we have Joseph Stalin. He didn't really like that idea about the elites being in charge and the workers. He was like, let's put the workers right in here. They need to be in charge. So he was, but of course, in a totalitarian way. I am the head of the Workers' Party. I am the head of the workers, and I shall be a dictator. And that's what happened. So that was through dictator rule. Leon Trotsky, who had fled to Mexico, which is really close to the United States, he believed the workers were never going to be able to run the Soviet Union. They just weren't smart enough. They weren't capable. And that the elites needed to be in control forever. That's Trotskyism. And then there was a fourth flavor of Marxism called Maoism. Now, what Mao realized was in the Soviet Union, in Russia, and where all these other worldly nations. There was one thing that was required, that was absolutely mandatory for socialism to work: factories, industry. Now, at the time, we didn't have the tech we have now, so we're talking factories. That's what workers did. They worked in factories. And of course, those conditions under capitalism were terrible, to say the least. Workers were taken advantage of. Terrible things happened. They lived miserable lives. That was the birth of why socialism came to be, because of the conditions of the average person working in these slave shops, sweatshops, whatever you want to call them. Maoism didn't have industry in China. There was no industry to take over and to socialize. So Maoism became about peasants. Instead of mobilizing the workers of the nation, he mobilized the peasants of the nation. There's your 4 flavors of Marxism. All about class. The class systems stay. You still have your elites, you still have your workers, you still have your peasants. It's all just a matter of who's in charge. Well, the guy with the funny mustache, he was one of them, and so wasn't Benito Mussolini. And they got this crazy idea that it wasn't working. Wasn't working. In Italy, in the early 1900s, the idea of fascism started being developed. Eventually, Mussolini left the Socialist Party and he joined the Fascist Party. And then he made the Fascist Party essentially his flavor of socialism, because that's what the Fascist Party was. It was socialistic, but different. Because the Marxist socialists believed in a global domination of socialism. Mussolini only cared about Italy. He wanted socialism for the country, wasn't too concerned about abroad. He was not imperialistic. Later in history, he did invade Ethiopia, but that was right before World War II. We're talking, he was in charge for 16 years before he ever made any sort of alliance with the funny mustache man in 1938. Speaking of which, he, who was also a socialist, also became disillusioned with the socialist philosophies of Marx. So what was his idea? Well, his flavor of socialism would be based on race, or we should say more appropriately, ethnicity. As we know, he was for the perfect German people, and that's true. So who did he get rid of? He got rid of the disabled, the handicapped, the mentally handicapped, people with Down syndrome, people that were crippled, people that couldn't work. He also didn't like homosexuals very much. Unless, of course, he was using them for political gain to entice Russian socialists to become spies. That was fine. So that was his version. Racial socialism. Not class socialism. No class. Race. The Germanic race. The pure Germanic race. That was the difference. It's all about class. Whether there was class and who was running it, or no class at all. Mussolini still believed in class, the class system. He had his elites, he had the workers, he had the peasants. It was considered nationalism because he didn't care about it. The elites, they can still be elites. The workers will still be workers. The peasants will be peasants. There was no equity going on. He didn't care about it. As long as they were faithful to the state, knock yourself out. And that's a brief overview of fascism and National Socialism. Now, let's get to today. What you need to do is you need to figure out what these words mean, because they all translate into our society. And we use words like liberal and progressive and conservative, and we don't know what the heck that means, because what you really need to know are fascist, National Socialist, and Marxist. Those are the words. And it's about high time America starts learning something, figure out what you are, and capitalist. Those are the 4 words. Figure out what you are and what our government is, and what our government is trying to become. Folks, we're in a perilous time. Food, water, shelter, medical, a way to protect it. And most importantly, a plan. You need to know what you're going to do when things come down, because that's what's going to happen. You are living through the next revolution. Except it's not the one that this country had 200 plus years ago. Oh no, it's a lot different than that. There's a wave coming, and you're either going to ride it or you're going to sink in it. You'd better figure out how you plan on living over the course of the next 1 to 5 years, because things are going to get a little dicey. They're going to get spicy, baby. Real spicy. And if you're not ready for it, you're not going to be here. I'm the Upstate Prepper. I'll catch my people on the flip side.